Frozen Mustang desperately seeks shelter. What the man discovers inside will leave you stunned. The wind howled through the desolate landscape, carrying with it a brutal chill that bit into everything it touched. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, covering the frozen ground like a suffocating blanket. Trees, their branches burdened with layers of ice, creaked ominously under the storm's merciless grip. The world was a frozen wasteland, devoid of warmth, devoid of mercy. Through the blinding snowfall, a lone figure struggled forward. A Mustang, its once powerful strides reduced to weak, stumbling steps. Its breath came in ragged bursts, the warm air turning to mist as it collided with the freezing night. Frost clung to its dark coat, its mane stiff with ice, and its body trembled violently. The Mustang had roamed these wild lands its entire life, built to endure the unforgiving winters of the mountains. But this storm was different. The cold was too fierce, the winds too strong, and the relentless snow had stolen every last trace of warmth. It had fought for hours, searching for shelter, but the wilderness offered nothing. Then, through the swirling whiteout, the horse saw it. A faint, flickering glow in the distance. A cabin. With the last remnants of its strength, the Mustang pushed forward. Its hooves, normally sure and steady, faltered on the icy ground. Every step felt heavier than the last, but it pressed on, drawn by the distant promise of safety. The light grew closer, revealing the outline of a small, isolated cabin nestled against a grove of frozen pines. Reaching the wooden porch, the Mustang let out a desperate, shuddering whinny. It pawed at the door with a trembling hoof, the sound barely audible over the howling wind. The horse's body swayed, exhaustion threatening to pull it under. Its head lowered, nostrils flaring as it fought to stay standing. It wasn't just seeking warmth, it was pleading for help. Inside the cabin, the crackling fire cast long shadows across the wooden walls. The warmth of the flames flickered against aged furniture, the scent of burning oak filling the air. Seated in an old armchair near the hearth, Elias Bishop rubbed his calloused hands together, staring into the fire as if it held the answers to a past he had spent years trying to forget. The wind howled violently outside, rattling the windows with an eerie persistence. At first, he ignored the noise, assuming it was just another restless night in the mountains. But then, a sound that didn't belong. A heavy thud against the door. His body tensed. Another thud, followed by a faint, desperate whinny. Elias's jaw tightened. A horse. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his unshaven face. Of all things, why did it have to be a horse? He forced himself to stay seated, staring at the dancing flames as if willing himself to remain unmoved. He had turned his back on that life long ago. Another sound, this time weaker. A soft scrape, as if the creature outside no longer had the strength to keep trying. Elias closed his eyes, but it was no use. The memories clawed their way back. The ranch, the open fields, the sound of hooves pounding against the earth. And then, the day everything changed. The accident, the unbearable loss, the suffocating guilt. He had sworn never to let another horse into his life, never to feel the weight of responsibility for something so fragile, so easily lost. He had built this cabin in the middle of nowhere for that very reason, to escape, to be alone, to never be reminded. But the storm outside didn't care about his past. And neither did the dying Mustang on his porch. Elias's fingers curled into fists. He didn't want to care. He didn't want to look. But something inside him, something buried deep, refused to let him sit still. With a heavy sigh, he pushed himself to his feet, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. Step by step, he made his way to the door, each movement feeling heavier than the last. He hesitated, hand hovering over the latch. One last chance to turn away. Then another weak whimper. Something inside him cracked. With a resigned breath, Elias pulled open the door. The moment Elias pulled open the door, the storm roared in, sending a flurry of snow spiraling into the cabin. The cold hit him like a slap, sharp and biting. But it wasn't the wind that made his breath catch. It was the sight before him. The Mustang stood there, trembling violently, its dark coat crusted with ice and snow. Its mane was stiff with frost, its nostrils flaring as it struggled to draw in breath. Large, desperate eyes locked onto Elias's, silently begging for mercy. For a long moment, man and horse simply stared at each other. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, an old and unwelcome ache rising to the surface. The Mustang was young, barely past its prime, but the storm had taken everything from it. Its strength, its fire, its very will to stand. It should have been out in the wild, free and untamed. Instead, it was here, humbling itself before him, pleading for something it shouldn't need from a man who had sworn never to care again. A sharp gust of wind howled through the trees, cutting through the heavy silence. The Mustang swayed on its feet, its legs buckling slightly, but it caught itself at the last second. Elias clenched his jaw. He knew what would happen if he left it out here. The cold would seep into its bones, draining its last reserves of strength. It would sink to the ground, unable to rise, its life slipping away inch by inch until the storm finally swallowed it whole. He had seen it happen before. His fingers tightened around the edge of the door. This isn't your fight, he told himself. Let nature take its course. But he couldn't. Cursing under his breath, he stepped aside and swung the door open wider. Get in here, he muttered, barely hearing his own voice over the wind. For a moment, the Mustang didn't move, as if it couldn't believe what was happening. Then, with a shuddering breath, it took an unsteady step forward. Its hooves clunked against the wooden threshold, hesitant, unsure. Elias had seen thousands of horses in his lifetime, but something about this one unsettled him. There was an intelligence in its gaze, a depth he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just seeking shelter, it had chosen this place. Chosen him. The Mustang took another step, and then another until its entire body was inside the cabin. The warmth hit it instantly, and it let out a deep, exhausted sigh. As the snow on its coat began to melt, tiny droplets of water trickled onto the wooden floor. Elias shut the door, blocking out the storm. The howling wind faded into a muffled roar, leaving only the crackling of the fire and the sound of the Mustang's labored breathing. He turned, unsure of what to do next. The horse stood in the center of the room, its sides heaving, steam rising from its body as the warmth began to seep into its frozen muscles. Shaking his head, Elias grabbed an old, tattered blanket from the couch and moved toward the animal. It flinched at first, muscles tensing as if expecting pain. Easy, he murmured, his voice softer than he intended. I'm not gonna hurt you. Slowly, carefully, he draped the blanket over the Mustang's back, pressing it gently against the damp fur. The horse shuddered but didn't pull away. Up close, Elias could see the full extent of its condition. Its ribs were faintly visible beneath its thick winter coat, evidence of a hard life in the wild. There were old scars along its flank, healed but still telling a story of past battles. But what caught Elias's attention the most was something near its withers, a faded brand, barely visible beneath the frost and dirt. His breath hitched. He knew that mark. A ghost from the past clawed its way into his mind, memories flooding back faster than he could push them away. He had seen this before years ago. His hands trembled as he reached out, gently brushing the dirt away. The more he uncovered, the harder his heart pounded. The brand was unmistakable. This Mustang wasn't just any horse. It had belonged to her. A sudden rush of emotion struck Elias like a blow to the chest, leaving him momentarily frozen. It was impossible. This horse should have been lost forever, should have never survived out there on its own. And yet, here it was, standing in his cabin, looking at him as if it had always known it would find its way back to him. A lump formed in his throat. "How the hell did you make it out there?" he whispered, almost to himself. The Mustang exhaled, its warm breath misting in the cool air of the cabin. It didn't answer, of course, but Elias felt something shift between them. A silent understanding. A connection he thought he had buried long ago. He should have been angry. He should have sent the horse back into the storm, forced himself to walk away before the memories consumed him. But for the first time in years, something inside him cracked. Elias let out a slow, shaky breath. "All right," he muttered, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "Looks like you're staying the night." The Mustang blinked, its dark eyes unreadable. Elias moved to the fireplace, grabbing another log and throwing it onto the flames. He wasn't sure why he did it. Maybe for warmth, or maybe because deep down he knew he wasn't just keeping the Mustang warm. He was keeping himself from turning cold again. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, something had changed. The past, once buried, was clawing its way back to the surface. And Elias wasn't sure he was ready for what it would bring. As the storm continued to rage outside, Elias paced near the fireplace, his mind a tangled mess of emotions. The Mustang stood silently in the warmth of the cabin, its breath steadying, eyes still fixed on him. Something about the horse unsettled him. Not in a way that sparked fear, but in a way that made his chest feel tight, like something long forgotten was creeping back into his soul. He had already accepted the impossibility of the situation. This wasn't just any wild Mustang. It carried a past, one that overlapped with his own. The brand on its hide had confirmed that much. But why? Why had fate, after all these years, led this horse to his doorstep in the middle of a brutal storm? Elias turned away, running a hand over his face. He needed a drink, something to clear his head. Pulling open the small wooden cabinet near the kitchen, he reached for an old bottle of whiskey. His fingers barely brushed the glass when a sound made him freeze. A thud. It wasn't from the storm or the wind. It came from inside the cabin. Elias turned slowly, his heart pounding. The Mustang stood near the doorway to the back room. Ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. Something was wrong. He placed the bottle down without another thought. His feet carried him forward instinctively, his breath shallow as he followed the Mustang's gaze toward the darkened hallway. The back room. That door hadn't been opened in years. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the handle, hesitating just long enough for doubt to creep in. But the Mustang let out a low, urgent sound, a deep rumble, almost like a warning. Swallowing hard, Elias pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, dust floating in the air, undisturbed for years. A heavy silence pressed down on the space, suffocating in its stillness. The old wooden floor creaked beneath his boots as he stepped inside, the scent of aged paper and forgotten memories thick in the air. His eyes scanned the room and then he saw it. His breath hitched. On the far side of the room, half buried beneath an old tarp, was a wooden chest. He had locked that chest away years ago, sealing off a part of himself he never wanted to face again. But the Mustang had led him straight to it. A lump formed in his throat. Slowly, he knelt beside the chest, running a hand over the dust-covered lid. His pulse pounded in his ears as he unlatched the rusted lock, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet room. The lid creaked open. Inside, beneath layers of old blankets, lay a leather-bound journal, a familiar one. His fingers tightened around the worn cover as he lifted it, the weight of it heavier than he remembered. The pages were yellowed with time, but the writing inside was still sharp, inked in a hand he hadn't seen in years. Her hand. Elias inhaled sharply, his grip on the journal unsteady. The Mustang let out a low huff behind him, shifting its weight. It had known. Somehow, someway, it had led him to this. With a shaking breath, he turned the first page. And there, written in neat, careful strokes, was the name he had spent years trying to forget. The name of the woman he had loved. The name of the one he had lost. The past wasn't just knocking at his door. It had forced its way inside. And there was no escaping it now. Elias sat frozen, the weight of the leather-bound journal heavy in his hands. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the wooden walls, but he barely noticed. His pulse roared in his ears, drowning out the storm outside. The name on the first page burned into his mind, as if the ink had just dried. Claire. His fingers trembled as he turned the pages, each word pulling him deeper into a past he had spent years burying. The journal wasn't just a collection of thoughts. It was Claire's voice, echoing across time, whispering secrets he hadn't been ready to hear before. He swallowed hard, his vision blurring as he skimmed through entry after entry. Claire had written about the ranch, about the horses they had trained together. But one name appeared over and over again. Storm. His eyes darted to the Mustang standing in the doorway, its deep brown eyes locked onto him as if waiting for him to understand. A memory hit him like a strike of lightning. Storm. The wild Mustang they had found years ago. A colt with a spirit too fierce to be tamed. Claire had insisted on keeping him, swearing she saw something special in him. Elias had resisted, but Claire had never backed down from a challenge. She had trained Storm with patience, understanding his language in ways no one else could. The horse had become her shadow, following her across the ranch, a bond so deep it seemed unbreakable. Until that night, Elias clenched his jaw, the pain in his chest returning like an old wound torn open. That storm had been worse than this one. The rain had poured in sheets, the wind howling like a beast. Claire had gone out to check on the horses, promising she'd be right back. But she never returned. Hours later, they had found Storm standing near the ravine, his coat soaked, his body covered in scratches. He had been trying to get to her, but it was too late. The river had swallowed her whole. Elias had blamed himself. If he had gone with her, if he had stopped her from going out, maybe things would have been different. But guilt was a cruel thing. It festered, twisting memories into punishments, making the past unbearable. He had left the ranch soon after, sold the land, walked away from everything, including Storm. Yet here the Mustang stood, years later, pleading to be let inside, guiding him straight to Claire's journal. Why? Elias exhaled sharply and turned another page. The words blurred together before settling into focus. Storm is special. I know Elias doesn't believe in things like fate, but I do. I think this horse is meant for something greater. Maybe even meant to save someone one day. His throat tightened. Claire had always believed in things beyond logic, in connections that couldn't be explained. And now, standing before him, was proof that she had been right all along. Storm hadn't just wandered here by accident. He had come looking for Elias. Elias set the journal down and rose to his feet, his legs unsteady. He stepped closer to Storm, reaching out hesitantly. His fingers brushed against the Mustang's damp coat, and for the first time in years, something inside him softened. Storm had never forgotten. The horse nudged him gently, exhaling a warm breath against his hand. It wasn't just an animal's gesture. It was familiarity, recognition, forgiveness. Elias swallowed the lump in his throat. Maybe he had spent too long running. Maybe it was time to listen. As the storm raged on outside, something inside him finally began to quiet. Elias stood motionless, his hand resting against Storm's damp coat. The fire crackled behind him, casting a warm glow over the Mustang's sleek frame. Outside, the wind roared like a wounded beast, but inside, a silence heavier than the storm itself settled between man and horse. Everything in him resisted the truth staring him in the face. Storm had come back. After all these years, after everything that had happened, the Mustang had found him. Not by chance, not by accident. There was something deeper at play, something that defied logic, just as Claire had always believed. His fingers curled against the horse's neck, guilt surging through him like a tidal wave. How had he abandoned him? Storm had been more than just a horse. He had been Claire's heart, her soul. Elias had walked away from both. Storm huffed softly, shifting his weight, his dark eyes reflecting something almost human. Understanding, patience, maybe even a quiet plea. A sudden, sharp crack of thunder shook the cabin. Elias flinched. His eyes drifted to Claire's journal on the table, its worn pages open to a passage he hadn't yet read. With slow, deliberate steps, he crossed the room, lowering himself onto the wooden chair. His fingers traced the inked words. I don't think Elias understands why I love Storm so much. It's not just that he's beautiful or wild. It's that he reminds me of him. They're both so stubborn, both so afraid to trust. But I know, Deep down, they were meant to save each other. Elias inhaled sharply. The words hit him harder than he expected. Claire had seen this long before he ever could. His gaze lifted to Storm, who remained in the doorway, watching him with an eerie stillness. Was that why he was here? Had Claire known, even then, that one day Elias would need saving, too? His throat tightened. The weight of the past pressed against his ribs. Years of regret unraveling in an instant. And then a sound. Faint at first. A whimper. A scratch. Not from Storm. Not from the storm outside. Elias's pulse quickened. He turned toward the back room, the same room Storm had led him to. The noise came again. A soft cry. Adrenaline surged through him. He grabbed the oil lantern from the table, its flame flickering as he stepped toward the room. Storm let out a low snort, his ears pricking forward. Elias hesitated at the threshold, then pushed the door open wider. And there, in the shadows, curled against the far wall, was a foal. His breath caught. The tiny creature trembled, its frail body barely visible beneath an old wool blanket. Its coat was dark, its eyes wide with fear. It let out another weak whimper, struggling to move. Elias's heart pounded. How had it gotten here? Then, realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. Storm hadn't come for him. Storm had come to save his child. Elias staggered back, his mind reeling. Claire's journal, the storm, the Mustang's desperate pleas. It all made sense now. Somehow, through the madness of the wilderness, through the relentless snow and howling winds, Storm had found his way to the one person who could help. Elias dropped to his knees beside the foal, his hands working instinctively, checking its fragile frame for injuries. It was cold, too cold, its breath shallow but steady. It wouldn't survive the night without warmth, without care. His vision blurred. This wasn't just an animal. This was a second chance. A chance to do what he hadn't done for Claire. A chance to make things right. Storm let out a low rumble, stepping forward, his presence grounding Elias in the moment. He wasn't alone in this. For the first time in years, he felt something he had long thought lost. Purpose. Elias exhaled, his decision made. He scooped the foal into his arms, cradling it close to his chest. Maybe fate had been leading him here all along. Maybe redemption didn't come in grand gestures but in small, quiet moments, in choosing to stay when it was easier to run. Elias turned to Storm, meeting the Mustang's knowing gaze. "It's okay," he whispered. "We'll save him. Together." And for the first time in years, Elias believed it. If the story touched your heart, let us know in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed an unbreakable bond between a human and an animal? Share your thoughts and experiences. We'd love to hear them. And if you believe in second chances, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more incredible stories that remind us of the power of love, redemption, and the deep connections we share with animals.